The sun, a tired ancient eye, rose over an unbroken horizon of green, casting long purple shadows across a landscape untainted by ambition. This was the territory of the Great Pine, a wilderness so vast its edges were unknowable, a land where the only monuments were the mountains themselves. No stone had yet been laid for a city, no treaty signed, and the only paths were the meandering deer trails and the relentless flow of water. In the valley of the great river, which the people of the dawn called Kitchi Sipu, the Grand Flow, lived a young man named Kael. He was not a warrior or a chief, but a keeper of the forgotten. His gift, and his curse, was that he heard the land's secrets. When the wind combed through the pines, he heard the echoes of mammoths long gone. When he knelt by the Kitchi Sipu, the water murmured not of fish or mud, but of the great, slow shifting of the continent, the ice ages that scraped the stone bare, and the first solitary footsteps of man from the north. One evening, by the glow of a small fire, the stories the forest kept became too loud to ignore. An old woman, the clan's spiritual guide, had fallen ill. Her fever was not of the body, but of the spirit, a fading fire mirroring the failing health of a sacred grove deep in the hills, a grove the ancestors had pledged to protect. "The great tree, the mother of oaks, it is weeping," the old woman rasped, her voice thin as dry leaves. "A sickness comes from the stone, a hunger beneath the roots. It will silence the grove, and then it will silence the people." The stories Kael heard from the trees were suddenly terrifyingly clear. Not historical narratives, but a plea. The earth was shuddering with a poison, a slow leak of minerals unearthed by a restless underground spring. No human hand had caused it, but only a human hand could stop it. Kael took his leather pouch and his carved staff. He followed the whispers of the water, which led him away from the comforting flow of the river and up into the rocky, silent heights. The forest grew denser, the air colder. The silence here was not peaceful, it was expectant, holding its breath. He reached the grove at midnight. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the mother of oaks stood gaunt and skeletal, its mighty branches drooping. The sickness was a patch of unnaturally vibrant blue-green earth near its base. Kael remembered the river's secret, the healing mud, the gray clay from the deep banks that could seal the earth's wounds. Without hesitation, he turned and ran back down the treacherous slope, his mind focused only on the grand flow. He returned before dawn, his back aching, his pouch heavy with the cool, life-giving clay. He packed the earth around the weeping stone, pressing the gray mud into the blue-green crack. He worked until the sun broke the horizon, then knelt exhausted and offered a prayer of thanks to the spirit of the river. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a sound returned to the grove. It wasn't a whisper of dread, but a gentle, resonant sigh. The leaves of the mother of oaks trembled, catching the first light. Kael walked back to his village as the land woke up, the endless silence broken by the morning calls of birds. He knew the land would sleep again, that greater silences were yet to come, and that the greatest stories would remain untold for generations. But for this day, the river's secret had saved the forest, and the ancient, unnamed land continued its long, silent watch. The silence Kael had preserved was not broken by a shout or a battle, but by the relentless, monotonous sound of the axe. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Each stroke was a severance, a cut not just through wood, but through the very fabric of the old world. It was the sound of a new, irreversible ambition echoing across a land that had only known the soft symphony of wind and water. Elias and order. They were practical folk who dealt with observable reality, weather, hunger, labor. This felt like a haunting. Elias Thorne, the unofficial leader of the settlement, found one stuck in the jamb of his door one cold morning. The letter felt colder still, despite being near the hearth. The words, though few, spoke of peril. The grand flow must breathe. Chain the water, and the breath of the people will cease. Another settler, a miller named Jebediah, who was actively planning to build a small dam upstream on the lesser tributary, found a similar warning thrust into the dirt floor of his shack. The axe tastes too much blood. The pines will not stand guard for those who kill their mother. Fear began to mingle with the settlers' natural optimism. This was something different. It felt like a voice speaking directly out of the silent, untamable wilderness they thought they were conquering. The prevailing theory among the women was that it was the work of an isolated hermit, a soul driven mad by the terrifying vastness of the woods. The men, however, who carried the uncomfortable memories of the fleeting shadow and the strange, silent figures they occasionally glimpsed at the edge of the clearing, spoke in hushed tones of the old ways. They remembered tales about the people of the dawn, who were rumored to possess a profound, disturbing intimacy with the very heart of the earth. The warnings, however, were too specific to be madness. They spoke of the exact locations of their intended projects, the mill race, the planned clear-cutting zone, even the location of the well they were digging that was sinking too close to a marsh. Elias, though outwardly dismissive, could not shake the feeling of being watched. He thought back to the healed wound in the earth near the ancient oak from months ago, and the silent figure that had vanished into the shadows. He finally understood the true nature of the traveler who saw the future. It was not a man crossing physical distances, but a man crossing time. A watchers whose history was so long it reached into their immediate tomorrow. The future this traveler saw was simply the inevitable ancient consequence of the settlers' present heedless actions. One final damning letter appeared, pinned to the main gate of the growing settlement, using an iron nail. The quiet earth is stirring now. The silence you broke will return as a storm. The settlers could no longer ignore the chill. The endless, silent land had found a way to speak their language, and its message was clear. Their ambitions were leading them not to a new nation, but to a catastrophe. The future they were so eagerly shaping was already shadowed by the ancient warnings they had refused to hear. The settlement of New Hope was now simply known as Thorne's Folly. The ambitious plans for the grist mill were rubble, the timber warped and gray from years of unused exposure. The population had dwindled from 20 families to 3, clinging to the edge of the clearing like barnacles on a dying ship. Elias Thorne was one of the survivors, his once bright eyes now perpetually shadowed by the failure that surrounded him. The ancient land, which had first whispered its warnings and then scrawled them on birch bark, had ultimately made its message undeniable. The mill failed when the river, angered by Jebediah's attempted dam, overflowed its banks, not in a destructive flood, but in a slow, persistent marshiness that ruined the foundation timbers and poisoned the well. The land had won the war of attrition, and the settlers had retreated back toward the coast, leaving behind their dreams and the half-finished church, the tallest structure in the ghost town. The church itself had no steeple, but its heavy bronze bell, a proud, expensive import, had been mounted on a crude wooden frame beside the incomplete sanctuary. And every night, precisely at midnight, that accompanied the birchbark letters. Some said it was a traveler who saw the future. he felt the same inexplicable dread he had felt when he saw the fleeting shadow near the sacred grove 50 years ago. This was not a physical threat. It was a premonition. The man with the lantern passed the ruins of the half-built church. He paused only when he reached the bell frame. The bell was silent, awaiting its nightly command. The man lifted his lantern. The weak light
Gong. It was a single, resonant toll, distinct and deep, a sound entirely out of place in the dense, urban night. The men exchanged bewildered glances. "What was that?" whispered one. "A clock? The Old South Meeting House has struck an odd hour?" Samuel dismissed it with a terse gesture. "Nerves, gentlemen. We are overwrought. Focus. We must finish this document before dawn." But Silas knew better. The single toll was not the town clock. It was the midnight chime of the half-forgotten bell, carried on the currents of the quiet war from the depths of the wilderness, a direct counterpoint to their whispered plans. It was the land reminding them that the foundation of their new nation would be built not just on parchment and noble ideals, but on the unresolved spiritual debt of the past. The rebels whispered their future into existence, confident in their reason and their ideals. But Silas knew that beneath the solid cobblestones of Boston, the spectral armies were still marching, the smoke of failure still rising, and the silent, ancient earth was waiting for the new nation to inherit the consequences of the old silence. The foundation was being laid, but it was already cracking under the weight of history. A history these patriots chose to ignore in their haste to build the future. The winter was not merely cold, it was punitive, a final brutal judgment delivered by the ancient land itself. The cold was the consequence the man with the lantern had promised, a frozen echo of the storm that followed the breaking of the first silence. It was the wilderness asserting its final decisive power over the men who dared to claim its vastness in the name of a new order. The air was thick with the chilling presence of the silent marching regiments, moving just beyond the weak firelight, their footsteps still making no sound on the fresh snow. The smoke that rose from their meager campfires seemed to struggle, choked by the odor of decay, the persistent, fireless smoke of Thorn's Folly, now carried globally by the wind of war. The rebels' suffering was extreme. They starved while sitting on fertile ground. They shivered while surrounded by the dormant power of the great pine. The land seemed determined to teach them the final lesson that human life was transient and fragile against its timeless power. But the men did not break. The shared misery forged a steel that the Bostonian ideals alone could not have provided. They were no longer the ambitious, isolated settlers like Elias Thorne, carving out a selfish piece of territory. They were a community of suffering, bound by the whispered words of liberty that now seemed to warm them more than the inadequate fires. They were finally, collectively, paying the spiritual debt Elias and his cohort had incurred against the Kichisipu. Silas watched the moon rise over the frozen landscape. He saw the spectral line of soldiers pause on a distant ridge, their silent forms backlit by the cold glow of the snow. For the first time, they did not look like harbingers of dread, but like solemn.
Woman raised her hand and gestured, not toward the well-worn path, but toward the dense, unmarked forest. Alexander understood. The path of true leadership was not the beaten road of popular opinion or established law, but the silent, uncharted path guided by the wisdom of the earth. He walked out of the cabin carrying more than just health. He carried her silence. And years later, when he became a great national leader, his reliance on deep thought, his measured words,
and his quiet respect for the breadth of the land would become his defining qualities, a silent foundation beneath the ringing rhetoric, a final, necessary integration of the wilderness's enduring wisdom into the fabric of the young nation. The young republic was built on parchment and whispered ideals, but its continued survival depended on a relic of the ancient world. Years after the War for Independence had secured the nation's political freedom, a delegation, led by General Alexander, the soldier saved by the silent woman, set out to chart the vast unnamed Western territories, the very land that had exacted its terrible consequence. Alexander carried the map. It was a piece of cured deer hide, soft and pliable, a direct link back to the wilderness. He had received it from the silent woman upon his departure, a final, wordless gift. It was useless by any conventional measure. There were no rivers marked, no mountain ranges, no grid lines, no compass rose dictated north, south, east, or west. There was only one thing, a single, faint line, drawn in earth pigment, that snaked across the hide. Every time Alexander unrolled it, the line was subtly different, a new bend here, a slight elongation there. It never led to a fixed destination. It only showed the next step. The delegation's appointed cartographers mocked it as superstition. They preferred their precise instruments and celestial fixes. But when their scientific maps failed, leading them into impassable ravines or treacherous marshlands, echoing the failures of Elias Thorne, Alexander would unroll the hide. "Wait," he would say, his voice measured and quiet, echoing the lesson of the silent woman. "The line has shifted. We followed the shift." The moving line was not showing geographical location. It was showing the path of least resistance, the route where the earth offered its grace, the original respectful path the ancient people had followed. It was the land speaking in its own dynamic language, revealing its mutable living truth. The map was a guide for communion, not domination. One day deep in the wilderness, the expedition faced a wide, unpredictable river. The cartographers insisted on crossing at the narrowest point, a place where the water rushed violently. Alexander unrolled the hide. The line did not lead to the narrow gorge. Instead, it led upstream for half a mile, ending abruptly at a spot where the river appeared broad and shallow. Against the loud protests of his men, Alexander followed the line. When they reached the spot, they found a forgotten ford, a natural submerged ridge of stones that made the crossing easy and safe. The river was allowing passage there. Alexander placed the map back in his satchel, realizing its true, lasting purpose. It was the nation's constant, silent conscience. As long as the leaders carried the map, the moving line, they were carrying the wisdom of the silent woman, the memory of Kael, and the enduring respect for the land. The Republic's continued journey would not be fixed by static borders or human fiat, but guided by the ever-changing, humble line of the living earth, ensuring that their foundation remained attentive and true. Etched into his very being, the single, moving line that had guided him through the wilderness now manifested as pure, unwavering intuition. Then came the moment of profound stillness in the midst of the chaos. The drumbeat stopped. The firing ceased. A solemn hush descended over the valleys that had once echoed with the spectral footsteps of the silent army and the mocking toll of the abandoned church bell. This was the breathless sky, the moment the ancient land, the Kichisipu, watched and waited for the final, definitive human act. In that silence, Alexander saw it, the slow, heartbreaking descent of the enemy flag. It was a visual cue that symbolized the end of the old world's claim and the acceptance of the land's judgment. As the opposing colors touched the earth, a collective sound rose from the American lines, a cheer that was raw, exhausted, and yet utterly pure. Hope rose again. It was a hope forged in the cold, stamped by hunger, and certified by the silent woman's blessing. The new identity was born then, not in a political treaty or a parchment document, but in the acceptance of the land's terms. The noise of the cannons, the final human chaos, had served to scrub the atmosphere clean of the spectral smoke and the lingering dread. The long shadow of fear that had covered the land was finally pulled back, revealing a new, vulnerable nation. The foundation laid in the Boston attic, the whispered words of liberty, was now cemented by the humility learned in the frozen valleys. The identity born under that breathless sky was one defined by resilience, by the measured quietness of its leaders, and by the enduring respect for the vast, unforgiving, yet ultimately accepting land. The war was over. The land was free of the old claims, and the people were free of the old fear. The age of whispers and consequence had ended, giving way to the loud, arduous, but hopeful work of building the nation. The cycle was complete. The long walk home was the final, defining campaign. It was fought not against an army, but against memory, distance, and the deep, pervasive silence that had finally settled over the valleys. The war's end was a loud spectacle, but the nation's true beginning was this quiet, measured shuffle of tired feet on the dirt roads. Silas, the young dispatch rider, now seasoned into a captain, was among the thousands making the pilgrimage back to their scattered homes. He walked with a limp, and his uniform was threadbare, but his gaze was steady, focused inward. He was one of the proud, fundamentally changed by the freezing consequence and the spectral war he had witnessed. He walked past the fields where he had seen the phantom regiments marching without sound. Now the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his own boots on the earth was the only rhythm, a real physical sound confirming that the silent haunting was over. The land was finally free of the spectral tension, but the silence was heavier, charged with the weight of the blood shed. Yet many walked broken. They carried not just physical wounds, but the permanent scars of having seen the earth itself rise up in judgment. They walked with their heads down, forever listening for the mocking toll of a phantom bell, or the scent of fireless smoke, the lingering remnants of the long shadow of fear. The war had taught them that the true enemy was not a political rival, but the arrogance of their own ambition. Silas eventually found himself near the vast pine woods that shielded the marshy ruins of Thorn's Folly.
When the document was finally completed, the words lay heavy on the parchment. We the people. It was a promise rooted not just in abstract philosophy, but in the shared suffering, in the hard-won respect for the vast, unforgiving land. The leaders stood, exhausted and proud, and began to affix their signatures. They were not just signing a political blueprint, they were sealing the covenant with the ancient earth, acknowledging that the nation's true foundation lay not in the walls of the room, but in the enduring consequence they had survived. The words they wrote, guided by the light of reason and the wisdom of silence, still guide America today, a permanent testament to the truth learned from the whispering earth. The nation grew into a towering edifice of steel and glass, its destiny dictated by the loud pronouncements of law and the ceaseless hum of commerce. The names of the generals and the signers were carved into granite monuments, their words repeated in schools. But the true guardians, the silent heroes of the elemental conflict, faded into the deep anonymity of history. No plaque marked the memory of Kael, who first heard the rivers whisper their ancient secrets. No history book told of the silent woman who purified the nation's future leader with broth and humility, far from the light of fame. Thorn's folly was entirely forgotten, its ghost bell finally silent, buried beneath centuries of growth, its lesson of consequence dismissed as mere frontier superstition. Yet their guidance remained. It was woven into the very fabric of the air, the whispers in the wind. Centuries later, a young architect named Lyra stood on a wind-swept plateau, overseeing a new, ambitious project, a vast dam intended to harness the final immense power of the Kichizipu. Her blueprints were perfect, her calculations flawless. But as the excavators began to tear at the ancient earth, Lyra felt a profound disquiet, a feeling of deep environmental dread that logic could not explain. She was facing the modern version of the settlers' original hubris. She closed her eyes, listening only to the wind roaring across the vast plain. In that sound, she heard a faint, familiar echo. Not the chaotic noise of a modern city, but a layered symphony of the past. She heard the distant, mournful gong of an abandoned bell, the soft, determined silence of the woman who asked nothing in return for healing, far from the light of fame. Thorn's folly was entirely forgotten, its ghost bell finally silent, buried beneath centuries of growth, its lesson of consequence dismissed as mere frontier superstition. Yet, their guidance remained. It was woven into the very fabric